I'll start us going live. And with that, I believe we are good to go. Great. So welcome everybody to the third week OUSSG event. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. And this week, as we've changed our membership plan for the era of COVID, some of our members will be in the actual call itself in order to ask General Nagata some questions at the end of the event. For those people, please just use the raise your hand feature in the bottom left, and of course, stay muted throughout the call. As a reminder, people who speak, their video will appear on the screen. So if you would prefer to not be recorded, leave your video off. Of course, your audio will also be recorded. And with that, I'll hand it over to Leanne to give an introduction for our speaker.
Thank you, Matthew. Our guest tonight is retired Lieutenant General in the U.S. Army with over 34 years of experience in U.S. Special Operations. His final position was Director of Strategy for the National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019. Today, he's a Senior Vice President and a Strategic Advisor for CACI International. It is my great honor to introduce Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, who will be speaking to us tonight about great power competition and conflict, the effect of technological change.
Thank you, Leanne. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I guess it's evening time for you. It's still afternoon for me. But before beginning, I want to express my gratitude to everyone in the Oxford Strategic Studies Group for allowing me to attempt a small contribution to the important dialogues and studies this group has fostered and nourished for so long. As already described, I retired last year after almost 4 decades of military service, most of which, as you've already heard, I spent in special operations. In fact, this past August marked the 1-year anniversary of my unfinished journey toward becoming a hopefully useful civilian, though I suspect my family still harbors some doubts about my ability to succeed at this. I suppose you shall have to judge. To provide complete transparency about my current activities and therefore my biases, aside from the work I do as a strategic advisor and senior vice president for CACI International, which is a high technology and expertise national defense company based in Washington, D.C. I'm also a distinguished senior fellow for the Middle East Institute, a think tank also located in D.C. And I also run my own small consulting company with just 1 employee, myself, from which I do periodic national security and counterterrorism related work. My goal today is to speak for no more than 30 minutes, possibly less, and then proceed as swiftly as possible to your questions or your challenges regarding my remarks this evening. I have long believed that the greatest value that can come from a session like this lies more in a dialogue with you than in your having to sit through a long-winded sermon from someone like me. I do not appear before you today to provoke you, but I am hopeful that my remarks will be provocative enough to encourage a lively conversation. I want to begin by outlining how I interpret the title of this presentation, Great Power, Competition, and Conflict, the Effect of Technological Change, because I think there are clues in just the title alone for national security professionals who are today trying to understand, describe, and thereby design both policy formulations and effective strategic approaches for what I believe is an increasingly complex and expanding array of challenges that are primarily happening in the arena of high technology against the national security interests of the United States and its allies for years to come. I believe that the rapidly expanding reality that the human race is increasingly living in a world of unprecedented and endlessly accelerating digital technology that is literally changing the face of human civilization will also define the course and outcome of great power competition, and if it comes to it, great power conflict as well. Said somewhat differently, my premise today is that while the physical action of traditional national security capabilities, weaponry, hardware, and platforms, if you will, and the human skills and tasks required to wield them will always be important, the so-called decisive ground we have historically alluded to for centuries is no longer material ground at all. Instead, we must more rapidly and adequately grasp the complex reality that winning and losing, whether in strategic competition or in armed conflict, is increasingly being decided by how well or how poorly the contestants involved can understand and effectively employ rapidly advancing technologies that predominantly flow from today's digital age that we are now hurtling through. Said a little differently, these digital technologies that either reside within or are connected to the electromagnetic spectrum are already starting to dominate the capability requirements that nations like the US or the UK will need to safeguard or advance our security interests. Correspondingly, our abilities and our capabilities in the traditional realm of physical actions and physical abilities are being reduced to a still important, but nonetheless secondary domain. If my characterizations just now strike any of you as an exaggeration, I will also try to answer. How much more knowledge, how much more reach, how much more influence, how many more relationships can a few years ago, so long as that individual has access to a smartphone and the internet? Of course, the answer to that question is that today, the average person has access to unprecedented quantities of each of these things. The same is true when it comes to access by human beings everywhere to increasingly complex robotics and autonomous systems. For example, the ongoing proliferation of driverless automobiles or the rapidly expanding phenomenon of increasingly autonomous unmanned aerial systems. This also holds for the globally expanding access to artificial intelligence and machine learning, the advances being made toward quantum technology, the illumination that comes from our rapidly improving ability to process and understand big data, the rapid improvements in things like edge computing, photonics, space-based systems, and the like. And please remember, everything I've just mentioned and many other technologies I've not mentioned are being commercially developed and made increasingly available to anyone with the means to purchase them. And a vanishingly small number of these things are being exclusively invented by, built by, or proliferated by sovereign state governments alone. If sovereign state governments ever had a monopoly on technologies related to the electromagnetic spectrum, that monopoly has been broken forever. But my central point is not to impress you with the importance of technological change, breathtaking though it may be. My point is that I believe these changes are transforming the meaning of two words that are very much in the minds of US strategists and policymakers these days. Those words are great power competition and great power conflict. What I am today worried about is whether the US and its allies are effectively realizing how dramatically today's global digital age is reshaping how both state and non-state actors everywhere will strive to effectively compete or, if necessary, prevail in conflict. In my view, the evident difficulty that my own government is having in comprehending and adapting to this onrushing reality is an indication that this also may be our greatest vulnerability, both as the United States and as a member of an alliance as well. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to suggest that the nature of either strategic competition or conflict have fundamentally changed. Nations and people everywhere still compete over, and sometimes go to war over, the same things they always have. They compete for business. They compete over trade. They compete for scientific achievement. They compete for knowledge. They sometimes go to war over such things. They also sometimes go to war over access to resources, and sometimes they go to war for the sake of sheer enmity, whether it be tribal, racial, ethnic, religious, cultural, or the like. So it has always been, and so it remains. However, I do believe that what is fundamentally changing all around us is the character of competition and conflict. And this is primarily because of the sweeping technology changes I've already mentioned, and many I have not. Unfortunately, I believe my own government is having significant difficulty today either comprehending or adapting to how both adversary state and non-state actors are increasingly proving more able to rapidly when compared to the rather ponderous American government bureaucracy's abilities, thereby giving both competitors and enemies alike strategic advantages that increasingly imperil our interests. Let me try to make this a little more tangible by providing some examples that I think are illustrative of these challenges the United States, and by extension its allies, now have. The first is oriented on what is arguably an important intangible challenge. The second is a more tangible challenge and is related to a common narrative I keep hearing in national security circles regarding the relative importance of great power competition and conflict. So first, the intangible challenge. I don't think this audience requires much in the way of a description how much difficulty the United States has been having for many years now in effectively and persuasively conveying its intentions, its interests, its values, its actions, and its aspirations to the rest of the world. The US government still wants populations everywhere to believe that America, while never perfect, at least has noble intentions. We want them to believe that our economic, diplomatic, informational, and military activities, while certainly self-serving, are also reasonably benevolent, useful, necessary, and/or well-intentioned for the rest of the world, and particularly for our allies. We still want them to believe that America's outsized influence on everything from international financial and banking practices to international organizations and their rules and methods, to scientific and industrial standards, to internet protocols and beyond, for all people everywhere, even if sometimes flawed in practice. And that the United States government, however imperfectly, does indeed strive for a common, even global good. And of course, we still want our allies, such as the UK, to believe that when the going gets tough, America will be there for them. However, I don't believe one can credibly argue that America is universally succeeding at these things today. On the contrary, one thing became very clear to me in my final 2 decades of military service, wherein I spent far more time overseas than I did in my own country. Whatever America's reputation for noble intentions, for strategic reliability, or for being a force for good around the world may have once been, it has been eroding significantly in recent years. Now, it would be inaccurate and unfair to assign all the blame for this erosion on technological changes alone. Some of this erosion is directly tied to strategic choices the United States has made over several administrations that many in the world believe were at best serious mistakes or at worst malicious in either intent or implementation. Some of it can also probably be explained by predictable suspicions that arise about any state that develops significant wealth and power overmatch as the United States still has. However, as most of the human dialogue and communication has increasingly migrated almost exclusively into our new digital telecommunications reality and its companion, the internet, a great deal of this erosion has come from the lamentable fact that the United States government increasingly finds itself being outcompeted in the global 24/7 contest of ideas, beliefs, values, and messages that billions of people can and are being immersed in every single day. I use this made-up term outcompeted very deliberately. This is a strategic competition, and I believe it is at the heart of great power competition, and it is one that the United States is too often not winning today. This has been most dramatically brought home to me personally by a professional colleague who today runs her own social media analytics company here in the US. Over the past several years, she has repeatedly shown me how, after a significant economic, diplomatic, or military international action by the United States, one recent example being the killing of Qasem Soleimani by US forces, typically the messaging activities of the United States intended to justify our actions, explain our rationale, illuminate our good intentions, and showcase the positive consequences of our efforts are completely overwhelmed and/or drowned out by the sheer volume of antagonistic messaging that our competitors and adversaries are able to produce on the internet at dazzling speeds that we typically do not match, and often by very wide margins. And perhaps most lamentably, in many of these cases, the volume of our adversaries' messaging in just the English language alone, not including their messaging in other tongues, far exceeds what the United States government is typically able to broadcast. I also suspect there are some in this audience who have experienced what I too often experienced when I was a Special Forces field commander, and had the occasional temerity to point out to a visiting senior US official that our enemies were sometimes more persuasive with a population than we were. There were a few times when it prompted a rather indignant response from such an official, something along the lines of, "General Nagata, they just need to understand that we are telling the truth, and what the enemy is saying is a pack of lies." Well, rather obviously, it doesn't matter if America believes it is telling the truth if either, number one, nobody hears us because we're being drowned out by someone else's sheer volume, or two, nobody believes us because we don't understand how to effectively communicate with people who neither think like Americans or understand our language, or both. Let me move on to my second example, a somewhat more tangible one. I'll begin by making a brief observation about a debate that has emerged within the US government over the past several years, the argument over whether the United States should be shifting away from counterterrorism so that we may become a more effective in great power competition, and if necessary, in great power conflict. Whether by those words I've just used or by some other similar formulation, it has become a debate over whether our government should retain or move away from the strategic priority it placed on combating terrorism since the awful events of 9/11. Here's my view, though I'll admit it's an enormously inconvenient view if true. When it comes to the notion we must choose between counterterrorism or great power competition, I personally believe that the US government is instead, at the risk of using a very pedestrian analogy, going to have to learn to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Whether we like it or not, whether convenient or inconvenient, whether cheap or expensive, I believe the harsh but unavoidable strategic reality for the United States is that we must now strategically and effectively contest both global terrorism and what we are today describing as revisionist great powers, such as Russia or China or the like. I have heard many policymakers' pronouncements over the years that we must, quote, shift our priorities away from CT and toward more dangerous and pressing threats, unquote, only to discover that a decision to turn away from terrorism typically results in terrorism becoming much worse. Instructive examples are the previous administration's attempt to pivot away from terrorism-related entanglements in the Middle East and instead pivot to Asia, until the tragic events in Benghazi in 2012 forced us to refocus on violent extremism across North Africa. Another would be America's decision to militarily withdraw from Iraq in 2011, which led directly to the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, and once again fouled our efforts to chase other goals in other parts of the globe. I believe past will be prologue if we choose to repeat these experiments today. There's also another supplemental inconvenient fact that I also wish to mention here, one that I believe I'm well qualified to comment on, because as you've already heard, my final assignment in military service was as the Director of Strategic and Operational Planning at the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center. And one of my statutory responsibilities in that position was to strategically assess how well or how poorly the United States was conducting its strategic efforts against terrorism around the world. I was on record then, and I still believe it to be true today, that whether we like it or not, and despite all of our collective and extraordinary efforts since 9/11, despite all the lives we have saved, the governments we have assisted, the hostages we have rescued, and the terrorists and terrorist leaders we have brought to richly deserved justice, unfortunately, there are more terrorists around the world today than there were on 9/11. And by the way, I'm not just talking about terrorists associated with organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. I'm talking about all forms of terrorism across all political and societal spectra, whether it is terrorism that invokes a religious superiority, ethnic or racial superiority, or any of the other myriad political and or ideological causes that terrorists espouse. Of course, there are still people, both in the US and internationally, who nonetheless argue that terrorism, dangerous though it may be, does not constitute the kind of existential threat that a great power could create, and therefore there is still a valid argument to shift away from terrorism, because adversary great powers are so much more physically dangerous. That is a credible, rational argument, but I must say I've never seen things play out that way. Whether rational or not, I believe the explanation lies in the classic definition of terrorism, the use of violence to cause political change. We need to remember that all governments, particularly democratic governments like ours, are led by political actors who only enjoy power so long as they are politically sensitive and attendant to the views and the needs of their constituents. Accordingly, their most finely tuned senses and instincts are in this inherently political arena. At the risk of using a gruesome example of how this plays out in real life, while it is true that the number of Americans killed by the Islamic State right after Mosul fell in 2014 was very small, the visceral reaction by the American public, particularly after witnessing the beheading of a few of our citizens on internet videos, caused a political tsunami that no US politician could afford to ignore, and the authorization and funding for people like me to go racing back to Iraq and thence to Syria became unavoidable and unstoppable. So all of these reasons, both intangible and tangible, are why I am convinced that, attractive and perhaps even rational as it may be, to believe the United States or its allies must, quote, rebalance, unquote, our efforts and our resources away from contesting terrorism and toward great power competition or preparing for great power conflict. There are ample reasons to believe that this is an approach that cannot and will not be successfully implemented, or even if implemented, is unlikely to endure for very long. Or perhaps said a little more succinctly, whether we like it or not, the strategic reality the United States, and I believe its allies, face when it comes to collective and national security is not best characterized as choosing between counterterrorism or great power competition. It is best characterized as the unfortunate but unavoidable compulsion to succeed in counterterrorism and great power competition. Now, I know this has all been incredibly uplifting, comforting, and positive as well, but never fear, I have one more dismal topic to cover before moving to your questions. Too often, when I listen to American commentators talk about great power competition and conflict, it seems to me they are intellectually separating them into two distinct, perhaps even siloed, strategic challenges. I've even heard people in Washington, D.C. say that great power competition is a civilian problem and great power conflict is a military problem, reinforcing the notion that these are distinct silos. I believe this type of distinction or siloed thinking is both wrong and incredibly dangerous. Instead, my view is that we must come to more effectively realize and act on the premise that our skill, capacity, capabilities, and speed toward more effectively engaging in strategic competition with so-called near-peer adversaries will be determinative and decisive in whether or not the US and its allies can prevail if we ever have to come to blows with these adversaries in an armed conflict. If this is true, we must turn our backs on the comparatively simple and convenient, but fundamentally wrong notion that competition lives on one planet and conflict lives on a different planet, and never the twain shall meet. Instead, we must learn to embrace the much more inconvenient, complex, and digital technology-dominated reality that our strategic fortunes, if we ever must engage in a strategic armed conflict, will be determined beforehand by whether or not we prove capable of prevailing in strategic competition. I will give you two reasons why I believe in this inconvenient truth. First, the obvious losses in strategic competition The United States and too many of its allies are already suffering, are eroding our ability to leverage our strategic relationships and project our forces, maintain our ability to wield other forms of power and influence internationally, maintain our scientific or technological edge, and beyond, all of which will become highly consequential if a war should break out, and probably set the stage for either our victory or defeat before the first shot is fired. Second, and consistent with what many in our military and intelligence leaders have been reporting for some time, our once pervasive assumptions that no adversary could challenge our own access to our own data, that our networks would remain secure, that access to our global bases and logistics were assured, that our troops would not be exposed to significant air attack, that our capital ships were too difficult to hit or to sink, or that our aircraft will be able to conduct flight operations with relative impunity and not be challenged seriously while in flight, and many more assumptions like these are today being cast to the winds. Here also, I think a very good argument can be made that they are now in doubt primarily because our adversaries are demonstrating the ability to outcompete us strategically in grasping, weaponizing, developing, and employing high technology in the arena of strategic competition. Perhaps it is time for us to more strongly consider one of Sun Tzu's classic admonitions as it relates to the possibility that what we choose to do in competition, where no violence occurs, with Russia or China, will actually set the stage for how well or how poorly America and its allies will fare if we ever have to come to blows. That unless we change course in our regard of the importance of digital and high technologies, we will find ourselves someday on the wrong end of Sun Tzu's famous maxim that, quote, "To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill," unquote. Now, before closing, I do want to ensure I've not inadvertently conveyed this evening that I don't think we need to ensure our swords are sharp or our muscles fit to wield them. That I've somehow lapsed into a fantasy that our physical ability to close with and destroy the enemy when it's necessary has lost its relevance. The United States and our allies should win every single physical fight we find ourselves in. And we should be willing to exert ourselves and make the investments to see that this is always so, though we clearly have some ground to make up in some aspects of the physical fight. But I believe it is even more important that we must prove ourselves capable of doing two things at the same time, and that while we ensure our swords are indeed sharp, that we realize our biggest and most rapidly expanding and consequential deficits relate to digital technology that operates within or is connected to the electromagnetic spectrum. I believe that we need the kind of overmatch in this digital technology domain that we have traditionally pursued in kinetic firepower. But this will require a wholesale reconsideration of how we do everything from technology investment, production, and procurement strategies, all the way to how we train and educate our people or conduct command and control of our organizations and forces. I will end by daring to do something that is invoked all too often by Americans like me, and close with some words by Abraham Lincoln that I now think, in this case, are applicable to the UK and our allies as well. These words that he placed in his 1862 annual address to the United States Congress serve as well as a fitting exhortation and perhaps also as an urgent warning to anyone who was uncertain of whether this strange new high technology world of competition or conflict does indeed comprise the decisive ground that I have argued has already become for our collective security. Lincoln wrote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country, or perhaps in this case, our collective security and our alliance." Thank you for listening to me this evening, and I'll be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you so much, General Nagata, for that fascinating talk. We're going to open up the floor now to questions. As we mentioned in the beginning, it'd be great if you can use the raise hand function or type in a question into the live chat on YouTube.
James, why don't you go ahead?
General Nagata, sir, I want to ask on your last point about the limited demarcation between power conflict and competition. If we take the assumptions that the democratic legitimacy of the U.S. is a compelling national interest for the United States and that is attacked by foreign actors, at what point would you consider us to be in the role that is characterized by conflict for competition?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Traditionally, we have demarcated competition from conflict by the sound of gunfire or something like that. When bullets start flying, when bombs start flying, now we're in an armed conflict, and everything that, and in any struggle we're in that doesn't involve gunpowder, we're just in competition. Unfortunately, I think that is an obsolete threshold these days. There are things that can happen in cyberspace. There are things that can happen in the electromagnetic spectrum that can wreak as much physical chaos as a bombing run can. One thing that I know worries nations everywhere, particularly industrialized, modernized nations, is how vulnerable much of our critical infrastructure can be to cyber attack. The specter, for example, of a national air traffic control system being deliberately harmed through a cyber implant or a cyber attack, and suddenly we have thousands of passengers in hundreds of airplanes at physical risk of their lives. I wish I could give you a better demarcation that everybody agreed on. I could potentially give you a better demarcation. The problem is there's no consensus about what that demarcation is. We are, at the risk of sounding a little cynical, I think the international community, or even at a smaller subset, the United States and its allies haven't given sufficient consideration to this so that we can collectively agree on when we have departed competition and entered conflict. There's more disagreement about this than there is agreement. And I have seen a few periodic efforts to rationalize this, but they've not been sufficient. Obviously out of government now, I don't know whether or not the effort even continues. I hope it does, because the fact that we may use the same terms, that this is competition and this is conflict, but we don't actually agree on where the boundary between the two is, creates strategic risk that we may not even be aware of.
I think we've got a question from William Evans next.
Hi, can you hear me, General?
I can indeed.
General, thank you very much for a very interesting talk this evening. I'm a fellow at the Changing Character of War Centre here in Oxford. I'd like to go back to your point about counterterrorism and the choice between maintaining counterterrorism versus great power confrontation or competition. My observation would be America has been very successful in recent years with its counterterrorism posture, with a much lighter military footprint in the theatres of jihad that concerns it, and therefore it is a reduced posture and is making good progress. Is it not therefore possible for America to make that transfer much more decisively towards the great powers, and obviously in particular towards China, at the expense of the more traditional heavy troop contributions to, say, Afghanistan and Iraq on counterterrorism? Over.
It's a wonderful question. I wish I could agree with you. Unfortunately, I do not, and I take no joy in that. I don't agree with the suggestion that our, to use your term, light touch in dealing with counterterrorism, which has been successful to a degree, is strategically sufficient. And here's why. I think Americans and many people around the world have been a little intellectually sloppy about what the results we actually derive from what we typically call counterterrorism efforts, which is typically the use of either law enforcement or military capabilities to mostly to save lives. In my own example, my own career, one of the things special operations forces do, and we're quite good at, is hostage rescue. That's a very important way of saving lives. Another thing that military and law enforcement organizations do is either arrest or, if necessary, kill terrorists or terrorist leaders who are plotting a violent attack so that we disrupt their ability to conduct that attack. And we've made enormous progress in this. Let there be no doubt about it. The not just the United States, but the entire international community has made enormous progress in this particular ability, the ability to save lives. Unfortunately, saving lives is not the same thing as doing away with terrorism. And as I suggested in my prepared remarks, despite our best efforts to save lives, there are more terrorists now than there were 20 years ago, and by significant orders of magnitude. What that should tell us is that using these military or law enforcement instruments to save lives is a very good thing, but it is also strategically insufficient. What the international community has not done so successfully is find ways to prevent people from becoming terrorists to begin with. And because of that imbalance, the ability of groups to be created and grow always outpaces our ability to use kinetic, military, or law enforcement power to attack them, to arrest them, to disrupt their plots. So unfortunately, terrorism keeps getting worse and worse despite our best efforts. But a lot of it has to do with this, as I suggested, kind of sloppy thinking where we think if we just do more special forces raids, we'll have less terrorism. That is demonstrably false at this point, in my humble opinion. So unless we can find a way to become much more effective in preventing people from becoming terrorists, and I actually don't know of a nation on earth that does this as well as they should. Perhaps I'm being unfair about that. I'm not familiar with every terrorism prevention program around the planet, but I know a lot of them, and I've yet to see one that I consider a roaring strategic success. So long as that is true, unfortunately, if we make the mistake, as I suggested in my prepared remarks, of turning our back on terrorism, we will end up regretting it, and we will end up having to go back.
Next up, we've got a question from Edward Howell.
Feeling that he did write his question in chat. Or Edward, are you there?
Okay, we'll just read it out in the chat then. So Edward Howell asks, given that you served in South Korea, I'd like to ask as to how you view the US strategy towards North Korea and how you think the US and its allies must address the threat posed by the revisionist, in quotes, power of North Korea.
I did once serve in Korea in 1983. I have not been back to that country since then. So everyone should tremble at the notion I'm going to try to answer this question, because I am so outdated when it comes to the situation that South Korea, the United States, and our other allies in that region now face when it comes to a nuclear-armed North Korea. But since you asked, I'll try to answer. I just take it with a grain of salt because I'm hardly an expert. I think what the United States and our allies regarding that peninsula face, including the South Koreans themselves, is a strategic paradox for which there is no obvious solution or escape. I think the best we can do is attempt enough of a I don't know whether to call it balance of power or balance of terror between America, the South Koreans, and our allies, and the North Korean regime, that the idea of going to war is so horrible that it never happens. But rather obviously, I am unaware of a mechanism or an approach that someone can articulate today that can get us out of that paradox, or to use a much older analogy, untie this Gordian knot. It is a Gordian knot. Very unsatisfying, I know, but that's the best I can do.
All right. If I may ask a question quickly, you mentioned the cyber capabilities in particular as a rising threat, particularly from great powers. Yet at the same time, you mentioned the access of a single individual with a smartphone and access to the internet. I think up until now we have largely see use by terrorist forces of significant cyber threats. Do you think that will? Well, A, do you agree with that characterization? And B, do you think that will change to the future?
Well, it will change. I mean, if anything is changing at blistering speed, it's both access to and the application of human activity online. So I mean, it's changing right in front of our eyes. It's a little funny now to think of things like Facebook or Twitter as kind of passé because they were invented just a few years ago. Who knows what the next phenomenon will be in terms of online communication or activity. But it is certainly coming. But back to your question, the dangers of a cyber attack are quite real. And as more and more important institutions, important systems, important capabilities become tethered to the internet, theoretically, the more the likelihood rises that eventually some bad actor will do something on the internet that causes a catastrophe. I mean, I don't want it to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, but I think it's probably a statistical inevitability at this point. But that's actually not worries me most. What worries me most is what we see happening all around us, is this fight over influence that occurs every second of every hour, of every day, of every year, now and into the foreseeable future. The ability of people to influence, shape, or alter three really important things. Number one, what people believe. Number two, what people value. And number three, what people adopt as their personal practices or traditions. By the way, I once had an anthropologist tell me that these three things, beliefs, values, and traditions or practices, basically are the underpinnings of a culture. If you can identify what people believe, what people value, and what their traditions are, you can pretty much describe their culture. Whether or not that's true, it's a powerful combination. And what worries me most is the fact that this is being done with such abandon and so few consequences, and at such speed and no ability to control it, that it's wreaking havoc with the ability of governments, including my own, to communicate with, to be effective in supporting, or to even understand their own population, their own constituents that vote them into office. They're losing touch with because there are so many competing voices, so many competing messages that are online, and that problem's only going to get worse. I wish I could tell you where I think this will end. I have no idea at this point, but one thing is for sure, the war of influence that is being waged every single second of every single day on the internet should worry all of us, particularly if you believe that a sovereign state government, whatever its flaws may be, is actually important. Because the sovereign state governments are losing their voice with their own population because of this phenomenon.
Great. With that, I think we'll throw it over to one of our YouTube comments, which is from John Mike. To what extent do you agree with the idea that we exist in a state of constant struggle, the increased uncertainty between peace and conflict? I think he might be quoting a professor named Lucas Kello, but please.
So it's a fair question. There's a part of me that reacts to that question with saying, well, thus has it always been. Since the dawn of human civilization, small and large civilizations throughout human history have lurched between something called peace and something called war continuously. And I actually had to do a search for a different speech I was making the other day, and I had to quickly do some research to list all the armed conflicts the United States has been in since the establishment of the Republic, and it was a really long list. And I got done with that. Right when I got done writing that list, I started thinking about all the times I've heard a U.S. government official talk about how America is a peace-loving nation, to which, to a degree, yes, we are, but oh my God, we've engaged in a lot of war. The same is true of most nations, frankly. Maybe not all, but most. So that's my first answer. Nothing new to see here. On the other hand, there is a profound difference because it is an increasingly connected world, connected in so many different ways, connected informationally, in terms of trade, in terms of finances, in terms of everything, that as far smarter people than me have pointed out for many years, a small reverberation somewhere in the world can have significant consequences. It's kind of the digital version of the butterfly effect, for lack of a better analogy. The fact that these reverberations can happen literally at the speed of light and can connect a belief or an act or a process on one side of the planet to the other side of the planet at literal light speed makes it a very different world for the current generation and future generations. Actually, all of this is going to accelerate. This is science fiction ever more rapidly becoming science reality. That's what we're living in. So I wish I could tell you what this vibration between peace and conflict are going to look like in the future. I really don't. I can barely describe what it is right now.
James, you raised your hand earlier.
Sir, I was curious to get your perspective. Since we've talked a lot about great power competition, do you have any advice for what the United States should do regarding relationships with regions, be they more countries or allies? And so the ones that come to mind are India, Iran, and Japan. How do they play into this?
Well, as a general matter, at the risk of sounding trite, but I do mean what I'm about to say, I long for the day when American senior officials, like I once was, whenever engaged in a meeting or a conversation with someone who's not an American, I wish we would all do a little more listening and a little less talking. Americans, Westerners, frankly, well, maybe all governments, maybe all peoples everywhere, we have a tendency, particularly the more senior you become, of the only thing I care about in this conversation is delivering my talking points, which means your first priority is to talk instead of your first priority being to listen. And I wish we had a way of turning that around. That's kind of a general, probably vain aspiration or hope. But I think we would be more effective if we did more listening than we did talking. But that's too general and too vague. Regarding any of the countries that you just mentioned, well, I'm gonna pick one of those countries so I don't go on too long here. Iran, we have labeled, the international community in large measure has labeled Iran the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. It certainly has a regime that engages in questionable activities and has been for a long time, but it is strategically important. Just its geographic location alone, astride the connection between Asia and Europe, makes it very important. And it will always be important, if only for its geography alone. But it's important for other reasons as well. You know, it's the heart of Shia Islam. That makes it important. It is important for millions of people around the world, whether or not they're Iranians. What I see Americans, and frankly what I see Westerners do, is engage in thinking or actions without understanding the leaders or the people or the nation that we're trying to either compete with or prevent from doing mischief, or just we wish they would stop the evil things that they do. I'll close by giving you one example. There was a conversation I was in about 2 years ago now, where it was a debate within the U.S. government about how to change Iranian misbehavior. Something I personally vote for. I don't like most of the things the Iranian government does, but regardless, we were having a conversation about how to change, how to influence what I think several administrations have called Iranian malign behavior. And one person in the conversation talked about, well, we just need to increase sanctions, economic sanctions, legal sanctions, whatever the case may be. The theory of the case was we just need to increase the pain. We just need to increase the pain, and eventually it will cause a change in behavior. It's an attractive idea. I think it's attractive mostly because it's simple. It's just dead wrong. And it was interesting. There were several of us in the room who said almost simultaneously, well, hold on a second. The current leadership in Iran is the same generation that survived the Holocaust of the Iran-Iraq War, where the Iranian people lost almost an entire generation of their population. There's nothing we're going to do with sanctions that are going to match the level of pain they had to survive during that war. So why do we think a lesser form of pain is going to change behavior in ways that the Holocaust of the Iran-Iraq War failed to? I think the end result of that is we never got invited back to the meeting.
We've got a question from Anna now.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your speech. You mentioned when talking about counterterrorism that one of the reasons you think it's important for the US to continue pursuing counterterrorism is because of public opinion. But this public opinion is to a large extent shaped by how things are portrayed in the media. So I was wondering, how would this feature into your assessment?
Yes, it is absolutely in large measure shaped by the media or things that claim to be media that are not. But regardless, you're absolutely right. The problem is that the media, this is such a sweeping generalization, I'm going to apologize up front to any journalist who may be online that I'm now going to offend. I don't mean to offend, I don't mean to be offensive. But I've heard from too many journalists, both US and international over the years, that have used some version of an American saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Why? Because that's what people are attracted to. So, as I used in the example I had in my prepared remarks, you know, I don't want to make light of what I'm about to say. The fact that some Americans who were captured by the Islamic State right after Mosul fell in 2014 were publicly executed is a horrendous truth. And fortunately, we have found many of those perpetrators, as has the United Kingdom, because there were British subjects as well that suffered this fate. And I'm delighted that many of those people have been brought to justice. But at the risk of sounding callous, the amount of mortality we're talking about is pretty small. Yet, how long did those videos, or once the videos were taken down because they were so awful, just the reporting on those videos, how long did that endure? It endured for months. Why? Because people, unfortunately, enjoy salacious material. And it caused a reshaping, certainly of American public opinion. I suspect it happened in the UK as well. But it certainly happened in the United States. It caused a complete 180-degree reversal in public opinion about whether or not we should have forces combating terrorism inside the Middle East. And I spent 3 years doing combat rotations from 2005 to 2008. I was a much more junior person at the time. And when I left in 2008, I thought, I'll never go back to that place till Mosul fell. And I got the phone call, Nagata, get everything you have back to Iraq right now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but off we went. And I spent the next 2.5 years of my life back in the same place. I believe past will be prologue.
Miriam, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Lieutenant General. So it seems that a major concern with the developing technologies to which you refer is the inability to control who has access to them and how they are used. So how hopeful are you that we might be able to achieve at some point in the future some level of international cooperation to try to at least attempt to control these technologies? Or is it just too late for that or not possible?
Well, I'm going to sound so equivocal and say it's both. I certainly think that there should be a more concerted effort, because if just one nation or just a handful of nations do this, it just won't matter. Borders and commercial transportation is all now so porous that if only a handful of nations try to institute regulatory regimes or control mechanisms, it just won't matter very much. It would have to be some sort of international agreement for some things, for some capabilities, and I hope we do that. It won't be perfect, but we should certainly try. But we need to go into this understanding that that a great deal of the technology that is being created is literally uncontrollable. That we literally have no hope of containing it or controlling it or even regulating it. It's just proliferating and iterating so fast, and the capabilities are changing so rapidly that it's just hard for me to believe, because all governments are bureaucracies. No matter how much we try to streamline them or improve them, they're all bureaucratic. The emergence and distribution of high technology is anything but democratic. I'm sorry, bureaucratic. It is anything but bureaucratic. Some of this is just going to be in the wild before we ever know it's in the wild. And once it's in the wild, there's no reeling it back in. So this requires us to do something that's potentially even more difficult than establish what few regulatory regimes we might be able to create and potentially enforce to some degree. And that is an even more daunting proposition for bureaucratic governments. Keep pace with technology. For anyone who's ever served in a large government, that should take your breath away. You should have the reaction that I have when I hear people say in government, we're going to keep pace with technology in the US government. My reaction is, when the hell has that ever happened? And the reason is because there are rules we have to follow, there are laws we'll have to follow, there are chains of command and chains of leadership that have to be respected, and all that mitigates against speed. It may make us more moral, it may make us more lawful, it may make us more reliable and consistent, but it also makes us slow. But I don't think it's completely impossible, or at least it's not impossible until we prove it's impossible. And so one of the things I wish is sovereign state governments like the US government or the UK government would at least try to keep pace. But in too many cases, I either see people not trying because they don't realize they have to, so that's a failure of ignorance, or they realize what it would take, the bureaucratic China that would have to be broken to accelerate our ability to keep pace with technology. And it's just so painful to consider, they just would rather not. But if we don't, aside from whatever benefits we could derive by a few regulatory regimes we could actually create and potentially enforce, the rest of it is going to get away from us. And that's what's happening right now, by the way. I'll give you one example. I realize I'm going on at length here, but there's a hobby shop. I live in Northern Virginia, here in the United States. There's a hobby shop not far from here where I could walk in there with a credit card and buy a racing drone. I'm sure most of you know there's an international sport of racing drones. But in this particular hobby shop, I can buy a jet engine drone that flies at about 300 miles an hour. And it's an old model. Imagine what a bad person with bad intentions could do with a drone that can fly several hundred miles an hour.
It's getting close to the end of the hour here. Do we have any final questions? If anyone would like to raise their hand or pose them in the chat. Graham, would you like to ask your question?
It's probably the best question of all.
Yeah, sorry, Graham, we can't seem to hear you. Feel free to type it in the chat if you'd like. I know you were pinging us earlier about some technical difficulties. Barring that, we do have one question in the chat. How do you think a medium-sized country like the UK should approach the challenges of great power competition/conflict, especially in an age when we'll be less reliant on our allies/nationalism?
Well, I'm going to address the premise of the question first. The trend is not a good one, as I've already suggested in my prepared remarks, in terms of the ability of, whether it's the United States or the UK or really all countries, everybody's taking a second look at their traditional alliances and their traditional relationships for a lot of different reasons. Some is because there's been a decline in how at least some people view the importance of those relationships. Others are doing it because they think they just have other pressing things to attend to. But the aggregate problem is that the weakening of relationships across the world is pretty evident. But you know, that the erosion and the direction that it's going in, I'm at the risk of sounding a little hyperbolic here, that this is not destiny. This is not a course that was prescribed by a deity and written by his finger on a stone tablet. Thus it must be. We're choosing to do this. So, you know, perhaps I'm going to sound like I'm living in a fantasy world, but political leaders of these governments have the opportunity to change course. I'm a little dubious they will, but the consequences of not changing course are becoming more and more apparent. And, you know, I have some hope that before it becomes catastrophic, at least in my own country, that my own government will mend its ways and return to a very old idea that our friendships and our alliances actually matter, and they actually matter for our future. I want to be careful. I don't want to suggest everybody in the US government has abandoned the idea that alliances are important, but there's been an erosion, no doubt. But I will say this, I think inevitably we will. I just hope we can avoid having the spur that causes us to change course be a catastrophe. But I can't dismiss the possibility that that's what it'll take. Hopefully we will see wisdom beforehand, not a catastrophe, but something that scares us enough that we realize, oh, you know what? Our friendships and our alliances do matter. So maybe we need to return to nourishing them more consistently and more effectively. That's not what we're doing right now, but I guess at the risk of sounding like neither an optimist or a cynic, I believe we will. I just don't know whether or not it will take a catastrophe.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment, so I think...
I can try another one, if you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you, Graham. Go ahead, last question of the night.
Well, thank you. Do you think that there is danger of pressure upon democracy if the efforts on cyber security continue to increase?
There is certainly danger to democratic institutions and democratic traditions, at the risk of engaging in a statement of the obvious. And cyber activities certainly play a role, particularly, as I suggested in my prepared remarks, since so much of human communication and human interaction has shifted into internet-based communications, chat rooms, fora, etc. But what I rarely hear people talk about, I hear a few people talk about it, but not enough, is the fact that good leadership, whether it be political or institutional or whatever form of leadership, could be good educational leaders for that matter, could be good financial leaders, it could be good community leaders at local levels. But good leadership is more important than the domain communication and transactions happen in. It is possible. I mean, we've all seen it. We've all seen an inspiring, magnetic, persuasive leader on the internet change people's minds, change the course and direction of the actions or the investments of large organizations, even countries. We've all seen it. So it begs a question that you did not ask, but I'll take the liberty of injecting it into your question, is yes, cyberspace activities, if malicious enough, malign enough, and consistent enough, can either continue or even accelerate the erosion of democratic traditions or democratic institutions. But it begs the question, are our societies, are our governments, are our academic institutions cultivating the kinds of leaders at various levels of government or in various walks of life that can persuade and inspire people to be resilient against, to turn their backs on these corrosive practices that happen on the internet? It is absolutely possible, but it takes a concerted investment in better leadership. And that is where I am at least unsure. If we're prepared to do that, there's a part of me that's dubious we're going to do that. But hope springs eternal. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, General Nagata, thank you so much for your time tonight and for your insightful comments about the very complex and critical role that technology is playing today and going forward. And as always, thank you to all of our members for your thought-provoking questions. It was a great discussion. Please do join us next week when we'll be having a talk with Daniel Fiat, who will be discussing European defense in a time of global change. Same time, 7 p.m. We look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.